Today I have the pleasure to welcome Dan Calacci. They're a postdoctoral researcher here with us. We've been working together now for a few months, almost a year. Really excited to hear about how this presentation frames a lot of the work that he's been doing around labor and technology. One of the really cool things about Dan's work is that they work really closely with workers. If you have a chance, take a look at a documentary that was made out of his their work on kind of connecting with a worker organization and a particular set of workers that were trying to analyze data from delivery platforms, and they help them build a sort of technologies, but really closely collaborating with them and co-designing with them, which is a really cool approach to doing this kind of research. And so, broadly speaking, Dan's interest is really bringing technology in the hands of people who are interested in kind of more fair and equitable labor practices, and thinking of data as the title of this talk says, data rights as labor rights. So that's kind of what frames a lot of the work that they're doing and that we are collaborating with on different things. Dan's background is they were a PhD student at the MIT Media Lab, and before that they did a degree in computer science, and now we're kind of here working together at Princeton. One of the fun facts that you may not see in their bio is that he's an avid fan of old Italian Muppets, and they were able to reconstruct a 1978 Muppet. Yeah. So they have a very varied set of interests, from startups to art to Muppets. So you feel free to reach out to them about this sort of interest. So with that, let's present, and we'll take questions throughout the presentation, and to keep it more conversational as well.
Yeah, thanks, Andres.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for having me. I'm excited to share some of my perspective on data and labor, and get you all excited to work with worker groups for better labor futures in the future and right now. And yeah, please stop me, raise your hand if you have any questions, or something doesn't make sense, or you have a thought that you'd like to contribute. I'm happy to make this conversational and relaxed. So really what I want to do today is convince you that labor rights and workers should be at the forefront of data and AI regulation, broadly speaking. This is a big topic these days, and there's a lot of different approaches, but my take is that workers should be centered in really any AI regulation that happens in data protection law. And there's a lot of reasons for this. I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of workplace surveillance and algorithmic management more generally, because it's not something that a lot of people have a lot of knowledge about. We kind of take for granted that we're in this world where a lot of your work is instrumented, digitized, and used now often by AI systems to create extra value on top of your labor as it already exists. And then I want to share some steps that I think are important for policymakers, workers, and regulators to keep in mind as we sort of step forward into the future of regulating artificial intelligence and data for everybody, but in particular workers. And I want to really start by motivating the work with a story from my own work. Andres mentioned this. This is Willie Solis, the driver here. Willie is a gig worker. And in 2019, he signed up for Shipt, which is Target's delivery service. And he did this after he got fired from his job as a construction worker. And at first, working for Shipt was really great for Willie. He knew how he would get paid, and he liked doing the work. For every order that people would place to Target, he would get $5 base pay, and then 7.5% of whatever the customer spent. But then in 2020, maybe about 6 to 9 months after Willie had started working for Shipt, things started to change. On Facebook groups, on forums, Willie started noticing posts where people complained about their pay changing. Shipt shoppers were suddenly not getting paid that clear fee anymore. And in fact, they didn't really know why they were getting paid what they were getting paid at all. And this is because Shipt has started moving to a black box algorithm to pay its workers. Shipt was late in the game on this. Instacart and other companies had started using really opaque systems to pay their workers for a while. But for Shipt shoppers, this came as a sudden surprise. The rollout was uneven. People didn't know even if they were being subjected to the new system or not. And so this is one example of a technology that really mediated these workers' labor conditions, but that workers could not interrogate, had no control over. They didn't have control over the data that was being used to train the algorithmic system that would give them their pay. They had no way of interrogating the system or even asking, well, if I'd done X thing differently, taken a different route, would I have gotten paid more or paid less? And this is particularly egregious for these workers because gig workers broadly are classified as independent contractors rather than employees. This means that they're not offered the same protections that normal salaried workers are. No additional benefits like health insurance or workers' compensation. Workers who get injured on the job have no recourse. They have to pay out of their own pocket for any kind of medical care. And traditionally, independent contractors are meant to have control over their own work and their own terms of work. But these workers don't. This is because these companies are using, like Shipt, are using opaque algorithmic systems to constantly redefine the conditions of their work without renegotiating it with workers. It's this one-sided relationship. Without access to the algorithm or the data that they're producing in even basic ways, suddenly these workers are really left not just in the dark, but with no real agency over their work at all. And this lack of access is important because Willie and other workers like him, and workers in lots of different fields, are now finding themselves in this position where the algorithm that they work with or work for really defines their labor conditions. And delivery workers aren't alone in this. If you think of sex workers who advertise their work or look for clients online, or free influencers that are trying to get more followers or sell a product on platforms like Instagram, freelancers trying to market their work, journalists trying to get readership and develop an independent audience. All of these workers have something in common today that they didn't 10 years ago or so, which is that algorithms now often dictate their success and failure. These opaque algorithmic ranking systems change, the actual likelihood of you being successful at your job, but they also change the nature of your work itself. In order to do your job, do your work, you have to develop skills and tools to understand the algorithm, play to its strengths, your strengths, weaknesses. People have developed entire sort of subcultures of linguistic systems, algo-speak for those who might be familiar, to interface with algorithms like TikTok in order to make sure that their content is eligible to get on the For You page. And this is extra labor and extra work that workers have to do in order just to do their job. And it also means that their work is by default instrumented, monitored, and scored in really every way imaginable, especially for people who are primarily making content on platforms. And so I want to take a little detour because some folks may not be familiar with the history of workplace monitoring, of measurement of work, or of algorithmic management, and talk about the history of this and sort of how we got here a little bit. Partially like just to share this history, and partially just because I don't often get an opportunity to talk about this stuff in computer science venues. So this is one of my favorite photographs from the history of workplace measurement. This is what its inventors called a cyclochronograph. This is a long exposure photograph of someone's fingers with small light bulbs attached to them. This photo was taken in 1913. This was invented by Frank and Leon Gilbreth, who are often credited or thought of as the fathers or parents. They're a married couple. Actually, Frank Gilbreth was the model. If you've ever seen Cheaper by the Dozen, that movie, that's the guy. They don't talk about his role in developing algorithmic or scientific management in the movie, but if you watch it, him and his 12 kids, that's the guy that is the sort of intellectual forefather of Fordism, Taylorism, and workplace surveillance. And so the way this would work is that they developed a technique to strap these like small light bulbs on the tips of people's fingers. We don't know what task this worker was doing, but they were doing some kind of task with their hands, maybe sewing, maybe assembling a part. And by using the light paths captured in the photograph, they could do this with several different workers, find the most efficient ones, and try and replicate that same pattern with workers when they did training. So they were capturing the knowledge from workers in this quantified way, and then generalizing it to then train future workers. And that in itself is a form of extraction, right? Workers develop a knowledge over time, they formalize the knowledge and quantify it, and then use it to train the future workforce. And this is really, this is relevant today for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that modern business publications continue to write about them all the time. Actually, Business Insider published an article about like top lessons to learn from the Gilbreths in February of this year. But also because this work was an intellectual precursor to Fordism, Taylorism, which, if you know things about the history of management, is really what people think of when they think of scientific management, using these kinds of techniques to measure workers, formalize processes, and to some people strip agency from workers more broadly. This is a political cartoon from the 1920s, from 1927, that is kind of criticizing this practice of scientific management as turning people into robots, and not just turning them into automatons, but actually sort of dictating what they should be interested in at work, what kinds of work they should be doing, and exactly how they do their tasks, turning them into machines. And a century later, we continue to see patents that the Gilbreths and Taylor would have been absolutely proud of. True to form, so this is a patent filed by Amazon in 2018 for a wrist bracelet. So this is a picker, if folks are familiar with what happens in Amazon warehouses. There are people who work to pack items, to move them around the warehouse, but also people who pick pre-sorted items from bins and place them in boxes so that they can then be delivered to you. This is repetitive, very taxing work. You have to reach up and down and be extremely accurate in your movements. This is a wrist tracker that if you move to the wrong side, would vibrate and sort of tell you, oh, you're doing something wrong, you should move over here. There's thousands of patents like this that get filed every year as workplace monitoring and surveillance and measurement becomes more commonplace and used every day in workplaces around the world. And this kind of monitoring risks more than just dignity and agency. Workplace tracking like this has been linked to enormously disproportionate rates of injury at places like Amazon warehouses. In fact, Amazon has rates of injury that are, if I remember right, I don't know if it's in one of these headlines, but over 60% higher than other comparable employers because of their extensive monitoring practices. Because when workers are intensely quantified, they can create quota systems and incentives that push workers to work as hard as possible towards a quota that's personalized to them. And then these quotas push them to work so hard that they injure themselves regularly, or are chastised for taking bathroom breaks, which are tracked, or stopped from taking breaks, which are also tracked. And Amazon can afford to do this because of the vast number of people who need work and are willing to work these jobs, work this for several years, get burnt out, injured, get fired summarily because they're not meeting quota, and then they hire new folks. A report just released a few days ago from UIC found that in their sample of workers, over half, 51% of folks who had been at an Amazon warehouse for 3 or more years had been injured and had to take unpaid time off in order to deal with their injury just from work. And this isn't limited to physical labor in warehouses anymore either. This was a really wonderful piece done by the New York Times last year. They interviewed hundreds of white-collar workers, so creative workers, people who do creative office jobs, writing, editing, but also things like administrative office tasks. And many, many workers, especially in the pandemic, started to be subjected to increased levels of surveillance, and not just in the workplace, in the office, but at home, because so many people, so many of these workers in particular, were able to work from home. And this took the form of software that would take photos of you and your computer screen every minute to make sure that you were at your computer. Software that would make sure or measure if you were active on your machine or not, assuming that any active time while you're at your computer is you working. And this led to some really interesting actions and responses by workers, such as devices like this. If anyone has ever seen one of these, this is a mouse jiggler. This is a device that you can buy on Amazon, on lots of places, specifically to just jiggle your mouse on your screen so that work tracking software sees you as being active and not away from your computer, so that you don't get docked by your employer, your boss, for being away from Slack for too long. And which offers a tip of how to take a bathroom break while working from home. So some of this is pretty dystopic. There are real problems associated with this: worker agency, safety, invasive monitoring, and also there's the problem of all the data that gets collected. When you're at home and you're on your computer and you're being tracked by this workplace surveillance software, that's data about you and your behavior, sometimes biometric, sometimes very intensely personal, that's then captured and owned by your employer. Workers have no ownership rights over that data. They have no way of accessing it. They have no way of contesting it, of asking their employer to delete it. In some places, there are consumer data protection laws, right? Like the GDPR or the CPRA in California. But these often don't extend to the workplace in the same way, because managers and employers have such broad rights over what they can do in terms of surveillance for workers that are working for them. Some laws like the CPRA have employment provisions that allow workers to request their data, for example, but stuff like this gets punted, right? Because so it was supposed to be implemented this year, but employers pushed back hard enough and it's no longer in effect. It may be in effect in June, but employers have no idea what to do. They're not used to it. But there are other avenues besides just state level sort of data protection regulation, which really only attacks a piece of this. So I want to return to Willie's story, because I think it illuminates a lot of what's needed in this broader ecosystem for workers and for regulators. So remember the algorithm that was suddenly a black box was this transparent system, then moved to something opaque. We worked with Willie because he had done something really interesting once he started seeing all these posts. He started actually collecting data from other workers about their pay, because he wanted to know, well, okay, am I the only one experiencing this algorithmic change? Are there others who are experiencing it? How are they experiencing it? What is the difference in their pay versus mine? Is the rollout happening in specific places? Lots and lots of questions that he and other workers had about this new system that they couldn't answer. The company wouldn't answer them. They wouldn't provide the information. It's not in their best interest to do so, right? So we worked with workers to develop a system that allowed them to share their payment data with us historic pay data. And because workers didn't have access to a simple export of their data, they couldn't press a button and get like a CSV or something of their work history. We actually had to develop this really roundabout system in order to collect this information. We had to have folks send us screenshots of their pay screens. They would scroll through their phones, take screenshots, and then text them to a bot that would parse them out, store them in a spreadsheet, and aggregate the data. We made some little commands that workers could use to get some additional information, some immediate feedback, like, okay, how much of my pay is from tips? Am I subject to the new algorithm or not? But the real kicker was being able to aggregate this data from hundreds of workers and start to get a look at the algorithm that the company wouldn't share with workers themselves. I'm going to briefly go through some of this because there's a lot more in the talk about sort of policy and stuff like this that I'd like to get to. But we were able to show that a little under half of workers were receiving just a really clear pay cut by aggregating all this data. So the new system paid them less. Some workers got paid more though. So it's not a clear-cut case of, oh, the new algorithm is worse for everybody. It's more complex than just like a wage theft case. When we looked more closely, we found that for workers that were getting paid less, they were getting paid less consistently. There was something about their work that made the algorithm underpay them compared to the previous system. We still don't know what that is. what it was about these workers. We think it might have been because the algorithm was trying to estimate how long a job would take, and then if you were slower than their estimate, then you would make less effectively. If you were faster than your estimate, you would make more. But it still doesn't explain why folks were just getting paid less than the previous system whatsoever. And these plots, right? This line graph, this box plot here, showing the hourly pay difference between these two groups of workers. This is stuff that is absolutely not accessible to workers, even if a group of them came together and wanted to collect this data without these technical tools that are adversarial that they use to share their data together. There was no way they would have this information at all. It took a collaboration with a research group, with folks who could write software, who could analyze the data. That's an enormous amount of work and a lot of resources to go into just producing a plot showing that they were getting paid less after an algorithm change. Something that the employers easily could have produced and shared, but there were no requirements to, there was no incentive to. Did not even really cross, I'm sure it did not even cross SHIP's mind to share this information with workers, right? Yeah.
Just a quick question. Do you know whether the company became aware at some point during this collection process that you were doing this?
Like during the project?
Yeah.
Well, we reached out to them like as we were doing it, because we just asked them, you know, can you share data like from all your workers so we can answer these questions? We got no response. And then we published a public report in collaboration with an organizing group, because we made an academic paper, and then we had these reports that organizers made for sharing with workers and getting them to join their cause. And SHIP sort of in a roundabout way responded to that. They like wrote a blog post, sort of not naming us specifically, but saying that, you know, some reports had come out and the data wasn't representative. Which in this case actually doesn't matter at all, because we're not claiming that this is true for every worker. We're just claiming, hey, look, you know, 40% of the people that we collected data from got an unannounced pay cut. That's bad. So they did not really respond to it in a meaningful way, but they didn't do anything adversarially to change it. They did change the UX design of the system while we were working on it. And we don't know if that was because they got wind of it and wanted to make things harder for us or not, because it was screenshots. We had to do like this OCR process. We would scan them. And so any UX change meant that our system would break and no longer collect data appropriately. But really the point here is not just about harm, right? Here there's like a harm, a pay cut. But it's really about transparency and the need for work that workers have to understand the platforms that they work with and the algorithms they work with in order to have fair information about the marketplaces that they're working within, just to understand their own conditions. Without data like this, it's hard to even know if you're making it in the black as a gig worker. Or if your pay is comparatively similar to other workers in the same arena, especially as an independent contractor, it's absolutely egregious. And so there's a lot of obstacles here that I think that this study represents that I want to walk through a little bit. So the first is that workers don't have enough access to data about their work or their conditions broadly. And this is true, like I mentioned before, not just for platform workers, although it's a really good case looking at platform workers because it's so at the edge of this, right? They're managed by algorithms. Their work is by default datafied, every piece of it, because they're working through an app. They are atomized and disconnected. There's no physical communities of gig workers for the most part. There are clear exceptions if you're familiar with how these workers operate. But there's no way for them to access this data, generally speaking. This is changing. GDPR access laws have provided some means for workers to access data by submitting access requests, but it's challenging. There's a whole group in the EU called Worker Info Exchange that does this on behalf of their workers, and they get back kind of a mess of information. It's not clear how to process it. It's not clear if it's machine readable. And there's other problems too. So the GDPR provides limited access, only access to stuff that is personal data, but there's a lot of other information you want access to as a worker. You might want access to the individual ratings that customers gave to your rides. There's a court case in the Netherlands where workers went to try and access their data, asked for Uber, and Uber gave them selective tidbits that they considered personal data that didn't intersect with privacy rights of customers or trade secret. Because when they collect this data and turn it into a data product behind the scenes, it becomes a trade secret that they own and control and have the rights to. And rights like subject access requests, your personal data rights, can't conflict with trade secret law. And companies have this shield that they can use to protect them from sharing useful information with workers. The other issue with this is that in the United States and in the EU, there's really limited areas where third parties can make requests on your behalf. So if you're a worker and you're a worker organization and you have 100 gig workers that are part of your group and you want to do a study like we did, but you don't want to build a texting service and deal with parsing all that data, you might want to submit subject access requests for all of your workers at once and that they consent to. But this is not really allowed under current data protection law. It's very difficult to be authorized as a third-party representative. You have in the US, you actually have to have a notary, like notarize a piece of paper that you authorize someone to be a third-party representative. So you can't just have an exchange over email. You can't just have them sign a consent form in a university. It has to be this formal, expensive process for a third party to send the request, get the data back. And this is important because as an individual worker, you get a spreadsheet back of all your data from Uber, and what do you do with it? Right? It's useful in context with all these other workers' information, not at the individual level. So this kind of system of third-party access is really crucial. But our current data protection schemes are really built around you as an individual data subject, not groups of you coming together to fight for agency or your work. Oh, I should have had this slide up while I was saying all that, sorry. Yeah, there's one last thing I'll say about this is that California has one of the better pieces of legislation about this, and it's rapidly changing, but it's very adversarial and companies are fighting it tooth and nail. And what this points to for me is moving from a data protection framework, which is what the GDPR sort of deals with and what laws like the CPRA deal with, to more of a data agency framework. Is how do you have agency over the data you produce, how it's used, and how do you facilitate people being able to use their data meaningfully rather than just having access to it in this kind of surface level way. How many Californians do you think have submitted a subject access request after the law was implemented, or people in the EU? It's very, very few. It's very, very few, because there's no real value as an individual to receive that data. There's examples of ways that kind of fix this. One is works councils in the European Union. So in Germany, when companies introduce new technology into the workplace, they have to have a group of workers that are elected representatives basically agree to or be consulted on introducing new tech. So new data collection practices, new AI systems, they have to be consulted and actually they get to co-determine whether or not this technology is implemented and how it's implemented. We have nothing like that in the United States, and most EU member states are still also very far from that. But to me, that's something of an ideal. And then there's this this last point here of when you're a worker and you're trying to bargain, like these workers, when you're trying to understand your conditions to organize, trade secret law is meant to protect employers from other companies stealing their secrets and being anti-competitive or getting a leg up. It should not be used to protect a company from its workforce trying to understand their conditions. We should have protections in place that bypass trade secret law in order to allow, if you're a worker group, you can use that data, but only for organizing purposes within the union or the worker group. And you can't sell it, you can't trade it to a competitor. But data protection law is not really linked with labor law at the moment. And so this is a big limitation. The second thing that I think it points to is that our frameworks around algorithmic auditing are not really enough for workers. How many of you are like familiar with or have worked on anything related to algorithmic auditing? Okay, yeah. So audits generally, right, are focused on things like addressing value alignment of algorithms, identifying harms, specific harms. What harms exactly is up to total political debate, and how to know which harms to try and identify is up to political debate, or holding an algorithm against a particular regulatory standard, right? But these workers like Willie, there were some things that were clear harms that they were looking for, right? So things like differences in pay, discriminatory pay, but there are other things that don't fall into this zone that we traditionally think of as being covered by an audit. There are questions that workers want answered about algorithmic behavior that audits don't cover, like how might I change my working process or where I drive in order to make more money? Or where do I sit in comparison with other workers based on my pay or my driving strategies? There are, or if you're a platform worker, these questions around how algospeak impacts your posts is a kind of question that may not be addressed at all by an audit, but it's still something very, very important to workers trying to have some agency over their work. So auditing, in my view, is like this very narrow scope. It's very important, but it's a very narrow scope for what workers need in terms of algorithmic regulation. As an example of this, this is a list of transparency concerns that we were able to source from a subreddit. Varun Rao, a grad student in the CS department, has been developing this kind of methodology for scraping subreddit communities and producing these kinds of lists using large language models. And this was produced just the other week from the Uber drivers subreddit. And this is a list of all of their concerns about transparency related to the algorithm. And if you just read through them, right, a lot of these are not really in any way something that might be covered by a traditional algorithmic audit looking to identify harm. They're general questions about the algorithm's behavior and how it impacts drivers' working conditions. And this is because the algorithm and the platform are their working conditions. It's a labor issue, not just a data and technology issue. So workers need a more flexible and inclusive framework for interrogating algorithmic systems that are broader than the audit or the impact assessment. So before implementation or after. Yeah, and then the last thing that I think this really points to is that access, so data access itself. So even if these workers were given total access to the data they produced, they had access to the databases or the CSV files of their data that they made while at work. This is not the same as accountability or agency at work, right? But a lot of existing and proposed legislation makes that assumption. So the Digital Services Act in the EU and the US Platform Accountability and Transparency Act and this risk management framework developed by NIST all rest in some way, and I'm happy to debate this or discuss this with folks who are interested, on data access as a kind of mediator for enabling all these rights for people. They kind of assume that access to data is the only limiting factor in enforcing accountability, especially for consumers. But if you have access to data, it sort of assumes this competent network of researchers or third-party advocates or organizations that are like just waiting for the data to be shared with them so they can show how all the algorithms are wrong. But that does not exist. that does not exist at all. The team that worked on this project with Willie, it was just me, and now we have a broader team, but it's still just a handful of folks. And data access itself is not our biggest obstacle. It's understanding the questions that workers want answered and understanding what they want to know about these algorithmic systems. And in the worker case in particular, worker advocates are already hard pressed for resources and largely lack technical expertise. There's not like a staff data scientist for your local UAW. That doesn't really exist. So this is not going to work for the labor context. we need something more. And points to another major point that I mentioned earlier, which is that all of this requires an inordinate amount of labor on behalf of workers. It's extra work just to understand your conditions the burden is now placed with workers. And I just want to make a note that this is increasingly important, especially as we look towards the future of how language models might interact with white-collar work. A lot of people think that, are talking about LLMs impacting creative work in terms of replacing creative workers, producing new content, but I sort of think something different. So this is from GPT-4's system card. One of the tasks that they did, if you didn't catch this, was actually have GPT hire a worker through TaskRabbit autonomously. It's a pretty funny story because actually, there's a CAPTCHA that that GPT-4 had to do in order to hire a worker or in order to do a task. And what they did is, just hired to hire a TaskRabbit worker to solve the CAPTCHA for the robot. And it actually lied to the worker saying, "Oh no, I'm not a robot. Can you please solve the CAPTCHA or the CAPTCHA?" And it worked. The worker did it. I don't remember if they were able to pay the worker directly or not, but that was not really the technical limitation here. The conversation, like the language model, was able to navigate this basically employment relationship with the worker. And if they can, if the system card shows this happening just as like a test case, in the near future, this kind of stuff I think will be more and more common, of language models not just replacing work, but also replacing sort of mid-level managers of directing work. And that means that there's a lot of workers who will be integrating and interacting with opaque algorithmic systems in the near future, whose behavior really dictates what work they do, how they do it, and who they submit it to. There's an additional piece here, which is that one of the most important things that language models do is they can absorb and present context to you as a worker. You might be a pretty good writer, but you might not know anything about books or book publishing. But if I give a contract worker, the state of the field of like science fiction novels, and I ask the person, okay, here, take all of these, use ChatGPT and write a blurb for this science fiction novel I have. An okay writer could do a pretty good job of that. But right now, we pay people for that contextual knowledge. We pay writers because they understand the layout of science fiction books and what the existing field looks like, not just because of their writing skills. As that contextual information becomes less and less valuable because we can get it from language models, even more work than just sort of these simple tasks will also be delegated using automated systems that are opaque. So I'm really worried about this. And it makes me really want more of this algorithmic regulation to focus on the worker case. I have a handful of other slides about what sort of should be done, but I might just skip to the end to sort of show it and kind of open it up to have a conversation. Because I think a lot of what I just went through, it's kind of clear, not necessarily specific steps, but broadly what I think is a roadmap for what should be done in the regulatory space and in the labor space to solve some of these problems. This is kind of a list of broad areas and then specific regulatory stuff that I think should kind of emerge. And basically, one of the things that I'm really trying to communicate here is that the labor context is a really high-risk area for algorithmic decision-making to be deployed. It's being used broadly, continuously. It's not being examined super closely. And lots of employers already use AI systems. Over 50% of UK workers who were surveyed last year said, I think my employer is using AI, but I don't know. So there needs to be more transparency in this arena. It needs to be at the forefront of AI regulation, not just because it has the potential to do a lot of harm to people because it strips them of agency or maybe potentially pushes people to actually have material injuries and affects their material conditions, but because there are actually really concrete problems here. Like I think in the consumer case of AI protection, I'm not sure if a lot of people actually care if their content is being used to train an algorithm, if your posts on Reddit are being used to train an LLM. But I think people who are doing creative work obviously care. For folks who have followed the writer's strike recently. People who are doing work that is dictated to them by an automated system care because it makes them feel inhuman. People whose conditions are deteriorating because these automated systems push them care because it changes their job fundamentally. There's a lot of stake that people can have in thinking about the future of AI and data in this space that I don't think really exists in the consumer realm. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. And maybe we can chat about this. I don't know if folks have any experience with this stuff, if you have questions about how to work on it or anything I went through. I'm open to anything. Thanks.
Thanks. Right, we have 19 minutes for questions. I have to leave a few minutes before we end. I have a class and also make it journey. But please feel free to engage. You have a question.
Yeah, so thanks. This was really, really good. Thank you. I have a question. So you mentioned that the access is not enough, and so but you bring up again reduce information asymmetry.
Yeah.
Have you considered taking that perhaps if there are ways or if there's interest in taking that one step further in terms of reducing automation asymmetry? And so, for instance, are there things that workers would like to be able to automate back? And that's not just like analyzing the data that exists about them, even collectively, but for instance, I don't know, as a gig worker, I would like my agent to figure out, according to my rules, when is the best time for me to work, what kind of strategies I would have, and so figure out a way of like pushing automation back so that, it's more than, because you can have the information if you're not the one making the decisions based on the information. It only helps so much, right?
Yeah. I have thought about that a lot. Yeah, I don't have any active ongoing projects, although something that I'm very interested in is I would just like to know and survey workers and understand what kinds of tasks they want automated in their work. Something I haven't talked about in this talk, but I think is really important is that a lot of times we think about automation as a sort of unstoppable force that, will automate the, somewhere in that middle ground of like highest cost and most automatable tasks in the market, because capitalism will just do this. But we have agency, workers have agency over what can and should be automated, or it's possible for them to have agency. And I haven't seen a single study really, maybe one or two. I think you shared something with me that of some folks trying to like figure out, what kinds of tasks they want to have help with from an AI agent, or what they just want automated away. If you think about what is like the worst part of your job, what would you just like to not do ever again as part of your work? I think thinking of futures like that is really important because soon we'll have more broad ability to automate a lot of tasks that we did in the past, and without exerting agency over it, it'll just become this undirected or seemingly undirected force. I think it's important. And there's some folks working on like the agent question in gig work in particular. Toby Lee at Notre Dame is like on making AI agents for gig workers that capture their preferences and then pick and choose jobs based on them on their behalf. So this is something that people are starting to look into. Yeah, it's a really good point. Angela on Zoom had their hand raised pretty quick, so I want to invite you to share. I don't know if I'll be able to hear you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks so much for your wonderful talk, which I think is really informative. I really enjoy that. But because I'm also have done a lot of research on algorithmic management, especially I draw upon data from both sides, which is the side of company and also the side of workers. By the way, I study the ride-hailing platform in China. I'm writing a book on that. So based upon my research, I find that, like data is really important, but knowing data seems to me or access data seem to be the first step of knowing this algorithmic system, because after collecting data, they also do the feature extraction, which means that they need to select some kind of data and group them together and to make decisions on which groups of data can be applied to which algorithm model. And also each algorithm model also involves decisions on, for example, like what objective this algorithm need to achieve, sort of things. I'm just wondering whether or not your research also discuss all kind of issues. I'm sure that you definitely concern this, but perhaps because the talk time limitation, you don't draw upon this. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I'd like to respond. So the first is that until recently, in the EU, data protection law did not afford consumers or workers with the ability to request data that was used in these decision-making processes. Like you could request data and get something back around how the system worked, but like you wouldn't get back the features, for example. You would get back just like the surface level data that was collected about you. Which, like I was mentioning before, it's not just meaningless in some way because you don't have the contextual information, but you also don't have what it's actually being transformed to, which is the really valuable thing being used in model building and training. That's changing though. The GDPR, there have been a couple of court cases that have really clarified this in the EU at least. Workers can request that data now. It includes like model parameters in some cases and the features that were then computed based on personal data. It's now included in this realm of personal data. That wasn't always the case. It's not clear to me recently on my read of the CPRA in California if that stuff is included. I don't know yet, but I think it's very important because otherwise, having that information can indicate what kind of automated decision making is happening if you don't know or need to know in order to specify requests. And it's where some of the value lies if you can get access to the model in particular. Then the second side of it that is you sort of weaved in is like participatory AI and sort of co-determination of the systems. Like what objective function are the management systems optimizing for? I've done really limited work on that topic, but it's something I'm really interested in exploring. There's been some good early work here in the US about it. From Min-Kyung Lee at UT Austin has done some of the earlier participatory AI design work that I think is really promising. I think once, I think it is far from being implemented, but if we start to see something like worker co-determination of technology, like Germany has been able to do in some cases, then the idea of a more participatory process for designing algorithms that are used in the workplace is really promising. I think there's a lot of questions to be answered because the incentives of the different stakeholders who are making an algorithm management system are can be pretty far from aligned. So it could make the process really complicated. But more processes that allow for input and actual agency in how the systems are made, what objective functions they're aiming for, is really important. A really good example of this is Starbucks implemented a scheduling system a few years ago, and they optimized basically for profit. And it ended up creating schedules for Starbucks workers that had them working like 20 minutes and then like a 2-hour break and then like 30 minutes, stuff like this. Horrible schedules that you can't schedule and work your life around at all. And they had to get worker input into how to change this system to actually work. Because without it, they were just driven by the corporate profit motive. So there's some examples of this kind of happening already, and there's some examples of it being positive both for the employer and the workforce, which is promising. But yeah, really interesting. I would love to talk more about that. Yeah.
So a lot of what you talk about is increasing transparency. So like employees have greater access to like what data is being collected and like maybe input and how it's used. Is there any push on reducing the amount of data that is collected like at the very start?
Yeah, so there's a whole kind of intellectual line of data reduction as an AI regulation tool. And I'm into it, but I don't engage with it really heavily for a couple of reasons. One is that I don't think, in some cases, it is plausible. So in the EU, there's a platform work directive that's kind of like an extension of the GDPR. And it includes, for example, a directive that makes it so that if you're a platform company, you can't collect emotional data from workers. But it's hard, this in particular, because what is emotional data? I know folks from MIT who, given a video feed of your face, can estimate your heartbeat. And your heartbeat is related to physiological signs like stress or interest, excitement, and that becomes emotional data. And so is a video feed emotional data? Or is it when it gets processed into emotional data that it's emotional data? And it's really about the purpose of the collection. Like the goal of that kind of legislation is not just to limit collection, it's to stop companies from making emotional inferences about you in order to manipulate you. And so I don't often see, I haven't seen a lot of cases yet, besides like the sort of more radical side of this, of like abolition of data surveillance and stuff like this in the workplace, which I think I kind of deal with on a different level, I guess. But I haven't seen a good case for why something like, okay, don't collect this data is better than regulating use in a sectoral level or in a company level, if you're able to give workers a kind of agency in deciding what that looks like. So I'm more in favor of, instead of pushing to broadly reduce datafication, to pushing to have, for people to have more agency over what the data is used for. If we have legal protections that stop companies from doing emotional manipulation stuff, and we have mechanisms that allow folks to identify it, report it, or show it relatively easily without a big burden on the workers, then to me that feels more effective than it's limiting a category of data collection. I'm sure there are cases that where it makes a lot of sense, but I haven't been super convinced yet. Yeah.
So how do we create meaningful agency without also changing the power imbalance? Or in other words, can any of this work without also collective bargaining?
Oh yeah. So yeah, I think it can. I mean, I think union formation and actual collective bargaining, and especially in the EU, is a really good avenue to approach this. We saw this recently in the US with the Writers Guild strike, where they negotiated and bargained for certain kinds of limits over how AI could be used, how their work could be used in training AI systems, and how AI generated content could be used in producing work in the future. There's a lot of problems with it, though. So one is that, especially in the United States, union density is like the lowest it has historically ever been. It's at like 6% in the private sector. And there are laws that make it very, very difficult to build any kind of union capacity. So right to work laws in the United States mean that if you want to make a union, one of the main ways that unions build capacity is by collecting dues so that they can hire people, maybe like a data scientist to go look at the data or build a system or something, besides just organizers to build a union. But right now, if you go work for a union shop in the United States, you don't have to pay dues. You get to like choose if you pay dues or not. So there's a lot of legal obstacles in the US to building more union capacity, which means that any solution that relies on unionism specifically really is risky. In the EU, this is different, and I am a big fan of unions developing more digital literacy in their collective bargaining agreements. I have a colleague, Christina Coquelin, who's developed systems like workflows and systems to help unions create clauses in their bargaining agreements that deal with AI and data protection, which is super uncommon. There's like maybe 4. But there needs to be more. There needs to be more folks like the Writers Guild that are willing to engage with this stuff in their bargaining agreements. One of the limitations with it is like the frequency at which those agreements get renegotiated. Technology moves too quickly for like a 4-year bargaining agreement or worse to be negotiated. The middle ground is like a bargaining agreement that creates something like a data council where workers have to have a meaningful voice in how data is used, how it's stored, things like this. But those models are few and far between at the moment. But I see alternate forms of like democratic participation in the workplace beyond just collective bargaining that I think are more flexible and more likely to be successful. Yeah. But it's an important part because how else, as a worker, without like top-down regulation, how else do you make sure that something like that is formed? But so the standards for collective bargaining agreements, like making standard language, like, yes, we're going to have a data council, and it's going to look like this, and it's going to be effective for these reasons, is something that I think is really important.
There's someone before me.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
Thanks so much for this very inspiring talk. So I was struck by the balance between what I call burden of explanation and degree of transparency. The 2 versions of payment that you mentioned. The first version, the burden of explanation is on the company. You have very clear rules about incentives so that platform workers will be attracted to the platform. Whereas once they're in the game, to try to reduce the transparency and burden of explanation, understanding the system, was shifted to the workers who need to collect data among themselves to understand how it works. I guess you also mentioned workplace surveillance space. So I think, so I wonder what are the factors that impact this balance between burden of explanation and degree of transparency? For example, if you're fully employed at a company, you would expect very clear explanations of your payment. How does that work? That burden typically it would be offered by the company, right? Even if you're surveilled at the workplace, you want to know about the rules. But for platform workers, I think their vulnerability, precarity had a lot of impact on these dynamics.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I have a couple of things in response. One is that even if you're a full-time worker with protections, those protections do not include getting notified about data collection at work, or what surveillance you're subject to, or what algorithms are making decisions about your work. They just don't yet. So even if you're a full-time employee, those protections do not exist at the moment. So it's not really like you have many more rights when it comes to data protection or transparency as a full-time employee. The precarity is an important point because a lot of platform workers will get locked into a system through a number of means, not the least of which is our algorithmically created incentive structures. So a quest, which is what they're called, where like if you do 100 rides, you'll get a bonus amount. But that quest is sort of designed just like the quotas in an Amazon warehouse to entice you to do it based on your ride history and your particular working habits. And they'll hang that over you and you'll keep working past when you should because you want to, win the game, basically. And things like that are not transparent. And so the mechanisms like the dark patterns in which precarity is enforced and how opacity plays into that are not shared. They're not really clear. It's not really even clear how to make a reporting requirement around things like this. And there's other infrastructural challenges with precarious workers who, there are workers that we've worked with, you know, when we talk to them about sharing data, they are worried sometimes about sharing because they can get deactivated without notice and no explanation. And so if they participate in an adversarial research project, it's totally possible that they get deactivated and they just lose their source of income. And so the precarity is also just an obstacle to logistically doing any of this work. I don't know if that answers your question or like responds to it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Sorry, I had a question. I was more interested in like the Amazon example that you gave specifically with the hardware device.
Yeah.
How do you think like physical systems like hardware, and also as these hardware become more and more integrated into our systems, our cars, our phones, like the watches we wear, how do you think that affects the data that companies can acquire? And also, do you think that that could be used in any counter surveillance purposes, or in any sort of unionization or like workers' rights purposes to fight back against how like the data that's being collected there?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of that information is more sensitive than, well, can be more sensitive. Location data is pretty sensitive, but like when you get to biometric data and things like this, it's a lot of additional information you can extract, like health status, for one, really identifiable information from your face or hands, for example, is another example. And it's a thicker data stream than sort of generally other companies might collect from consumers. So I actually have a belt that Amazon uses in their warehouses that I bought from the manufacturer. That's like a smart belt. And the way that this belt works is it tracks your location and accelerometer information. So it tracks like, you know, your gait, your walking steps, where you are in the warehouse, and then it measures how you're picking something up. So if you're picking it up in the wrong way, like with bad form, it'll give you haptic feedback and tell you. That also means, you know, that the employer has a lot of information as well. I bought the belt in order to understand what data was being shared to this third-party company when workers put it on. There's a whole other side of this that's very complicated, which is that a lot of this data is not even owned by your employer. It's owned by a third-party company that your employer contracts with, which really complicates the legal side of this. I've done 1 or 2 projects where we provide folks who are either not normally surveilled or who are surveilled with devices that collect similar data. So a smartwatch or your mobile phone as a sensor, in order to provide what we kind of refer to as a counter narrative, or historically a counter visual to the working conditions that an employer might see. And this is really interesting because this has really direct ties to what workers used to do in response to scientific management and time studies in the 20th century. Because they used to run their own time studies in counter to management. Time studies meaning like timing the actions that workers took, how long it took. Employers would do that and they would set a wage based on it. And then workers would do their own independent research and studies to try and counter the narrative from the employer in order to negotiate a fair wage as a kind of counter surveillance. And I've done a few projects where we've tried to do something similar. None of them are published, but we have tools that workers can use. Like we have an app that runs on Android and iOS watches that collects accelerometer data, location, heart rate, ambient temperature, which was a big one for warehouse workers. I think there's a lot of potential for it. There's some like tricky things here, like if a union is collecting their data, some people are not comfortable with their union having access to that data either. And so there's privacy issues involved. We solved that by having all that data saved on device instead of being sent anywhere, and then they have total control over who they share it with. What else? Oh, and one additional note is that there are some legal protections for this more detailed data. So Illinois has BIPA, a biometric privacy bill, that requires folks to get your consent before collecting biometric data like your face or your palm print. But a lot of workers have to use these days. Like there was one worker who brought a case against a university in Illinois because they used a hand scanner to check in, to clock in. So instead of a time clock, you scan your whole hand. And they were never asked, they were never given like a consent form or anything like this for them to collect this biometric data. So they sued the university because they were claiming that it was in violation of Illinois' DIPA law. For normal workers who are not unionized, this is fine. They can bring the case and they can win a suit. But unionized workers, it's actually this really horrible interaction with federal labor law, where when you do this, technically, because in union contracts, there's this like broad management clause, your union consented to that happening. Your union as like a third party representative consented to that data collection happening as on your behalf. And so federal labor law preempts this like state privacy bill. So every state privacy bill that comes along that allows you to like have a private right of action or do something to your employer because they violated, they didn't get your consent. If you're a unionized employee, that just doesn't apply to you at all. You need like a clause in your collective bargaining agreement about it. Sorry, that was just like a kind of aside that I think is wild, but is relevant to like the very thick biometric surveillance that some workers undergo. Yeah. Yeah.
So my question is about like what you envision the role that like workers versus like researchers with more expertise play in the algorithmic inquiry paradigm you proposed. Because like workers have a lot of questions about how the systems work and affect them, but it's really researchers that have the expertise to ask the right questions about these complex systems and understand them. Because I mean, AI and machine learning, they're very complex systems. So what do you envision the role of like researchers with expertise would be versus like workers? Understand this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a really solid like overarching response beyond what I do in my practice is when we do projects, we try and so like the case with Willie is really good because Willie had a question that was informed by the community that I collaborated with him on. So he had I did not start with the research project, he did. And I collaborated with him on the research on how we would collect the data and answer the question. And so I did the analysis because I had that skill set, but normal people have the ability to ask research questions. People ask research questions like every day, all the time. They have their own inquiries that they do into like systems that they use constantly. And I think as researchers, a lot of researchers do not give people enough credit for doing that work. Or having the ability to like develop hypotheses. They may not be perfectly formed, but you know, you as a researcher can help nudge that process along. You can lend your expertise. And so I really point people towards treating workers as not as participants, but as collaborators in their work. And trying to think of yourself as a stakeholder, as an academic who needs to like write papers or whatever, but who has a set of expertise to lend. And I'm still trying to do work like that. So we meet with worker organizers, we talk with them about what questions they want to answer, we try and prioritize the ones that seem most pressing or that they say are most pressing. We try to be really clear about what analysis we're doing. Eventually, I would love to build systems. One of the goals is to build systems where you don't need expert involvement. Like I don't need to be there. You know, they can collect the data because it's easy to use. They can analyze it because, you know, you can like type into ChatGPT and say, make a bar plot that compares X to Y, and it can like do it with the data that's available. But we're not quite there yet. So until then, I think the best way for researchers and experts to be involved is to have workers like take the lead in these projects instead of just as participants. Yeah.
I don't know, my mind is kind of blown about this whole talk. I'm a historian of like labor in the tech industry, and I'm just curious, like, are there specific publications or places that you recommend looking for other folks who are doing this kind of work at the intersection of, I guess, like precarious labor and surveillance?
There's a lot of really good legal scholarship. So like Vino Dubal is a good one. oh my gosh, what's her name? There's like a handful of folks in the HCI communities that are doing this work. I'm happy to give you some names sometime if you're interested. Yeah. There has not really been like any official conference or like gathering. There's some like sub workshops and stuff part of conferences that happen. But it's like it's an emerging field, so it's pretty new. But a lot of like legal scholars have been thinking about technology and labor issues for the past decade, a lot longer than most sort of computer science people. So that's a good place to look.
Thank you.